And this morning, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Joseph Spooner from LSE's Department of Law. Academics are sometimes accused by policymakers and others of evidencing problems without suggesting solutions, but this can't be said of Joe and his recent book, Bankruptcy, The Case for Relief in an Economy of Debt, which offers a practical and actionable solution to what he sees as an unsustainable economic model built on household debt. And I'm really looking forward to hearing his talk today. At the end, we'll have time for questions, and please do put any that you have into the chat. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Joe. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you very much, Louise, and thank you very much to everyone for joining today. So as Louise has suggested, that my talk today is entitled "A Society in Debt, How Bankruptcy Could Help Some of the UK's Poorest Families." So what we will be talking about today in the talk is we're at this interesting point in which we've obviously had a major economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, but this follows a decade after another great crisis, global financial crisis of the late 2000s. And I want to just start off by talking a little bit about the picture of household debt in the UK in the time between these two crises in the lead up to the COVID pandemic, and kind of the shape of household finances and the household debt situation in our economy before this latest crisis struck. After discussing that, I'll talk a little bit about the public policy problems related to high levels of household debt, and I'll run through some of the solutions to those problems that we've seen after the global financial crisis, and maybe talk about some of the shortcomings of the policy action that we've seen to date. Then I move on to discuss my particular area of interest, which is bankruptcy law, and I explore the extent to which bankruptcy can be seen as a promising public policy solution to deal with the problem of excessive household debt. In this manner, bankruptcy can be reimagined or conceptualized as a social safety net of last resort, a policy measure which provides relief to families struggling through financial difficulties when perhaps other policy tools and policy measures are not providing sufficient protection. Okay, so first of all, the main point, I guess, in relation to the picture of household debt leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic was that the problems of household debt that we saw in such dramatic form during the global financial crisis of the late 2000s didn't really go anywhere, okay? One might have thought after that great crisis that we would have new understanding of the dangers of excessive household debt, the problems these can cause for households in financial difficulty, but also for the wider economy. But things didn't change all that much. So if you look at some of the data that's been available for your studies conducted over the last decade, we see in 2016, for example, the Money Advice Service found that in the middle of this time between the two decades, we have 8 million people in the UK who could be considered over indebted, and 17 million who would be one emergency away from having a serious problem debt situation. Similarly, regulators such as the Financial Conduct Authority found major problems in credit card markets, payday lending markets, bank overdraft markets. For example, the Financial Conduct Authority said that there were over 2 million individuals who had problem credit card debt as well. So we're talking about the evidence building of a kind of very difficult picture regarding the household debt situation even prior to the crisis. What is interesting as well, a characteristic feature of the problem of household debt over the past decade was the emergence of problems in relation to non-financial debts. So what we might call priority debts, or just everyday expenses debts, such as rent arrears, council tax debts, debts owed through the social welfare system. This really emerged as a new problem during this period, and a very severe problem for many households. Then if we look at the overall picture, well, not only do we see this problem debt, but the ability of households to respond to this problem is very limited. So you might talk about the financial resilience of households being quite weak at this time. So the Citizens Advice, the Debt Advice Charity, found that 40% of its clients have negative budgets. That means simply even when their income is maximized, there is not enough income coming in to meet essential outgoings. And then we see the picture also here regarding the very limited savings for most people in the economy. Obviously then, when the crisis of COVID-19 struck, household finances in this country were in a very weak position. And then this weak position was exacerbated. And importantly, we've all probably read a little bit about the impact on households of the economic crisis which followed the pandemic, but it's just important to emphasize how unequal this was as well. And there have been studies documenting the fact that this the pandemic has kind of fallen unequally based on racial lines, employment status lines. It's hurt carers more than other participants in the economy, for example. What is interesting at this point is that I guess we can look at bankruptcy figures from this period. Even though there's been an extensive household debt problem during this time, we do not necessarily see that translating into bankruptcies. And that is something that we might need to talk about later on. And what has been driving these trends? Well, we had a period prior to the global financial crisis where there was a great buildup of household debt levels, and this was seen as part of a consumption boom. There was a new role for household debt of kind of driving economic growth. And this continued over the past decade. Particularly, we see these rising household debt levels at a time in which wage growth has been stagnating or has been very slow. There's this idea that one of the explanations for the rise of household debt is this idea that there's kind of been a substitution of loans for wages. The idea that people are not earning enough or earning at a sufficient rate to meet rising costs of living, and therefore debt was used to kind of make ends meet for households, but also to keep the economy ticking over in the face of a lack of wage growth. There's also been this idea that we see a trade-off between credit and the welfare state. And of course, over the past decade in many advanced economies, we saw reductions in public expenditure under austerity policies, and that has been linked to increased household borrowing, again, to kind of fill the gaps in this social safety net. What has been recognized quite widely in recent years, though perhaps it took a few years after the global financial crisis for this message to get through, was that this position of high levels of household debt is problematic, not just for households themselves who are suffering through the severe difficulties, financial, health-wise, problems regarding children's development and access to the services they need in terms of their development due to debt problems. There's many studies documenting the deep difficulties for families who are trapped in debt problems. But what has become clear as well is how this is a problem for the wider economy. So certain studies from the National Audit Office, for example, said that even if we just look at mental health costs and public housing costs, we're talking about £900 million per year. That study particularly excluded certain additional costs which it knew were significant but just couldn't measure, such as unemployment, social welfare spending, etc. And what's been really interesting is a lot of economic policy institutes and authors started by the groundbreaking research of Mian and Sufi in their book House of Debt, have also talked about the macroeconomic problems generated where households are trapped under a debt burden. The idea being that if we have lots of low income and middle income families in our society, in our economy, who are carrying a heavy debt burden, these families actually don't have resources available to contribute to the day-to-day economy and to drive consumption and to drive economic growth. The idea is that if all income of low and middle income households is going to pay back historic debt, there's nothing left to actually keep the economy ticking over. And this is particularly problematic at a time like now when we're trying to rebuild the economy after the downturn of the COVID-19 crisis. So what is to be done about this? Well, there's this great quote from our late and much missed colleague, David Graeber, who talked about the policy responses to the global financial crisis. And he described them as legislating around the edges. And he said, this is often how we deal with debt problems in our society. We kind of tinker a little bit here and there, introduce certain measures, but are a bit uncomfortable with confronting head on the problem of too much debt and actually doing something to reduce the levels of debt in our economy. So what kind of policy responses happened after the global financial crisis? If we look at in the UK, you could put together a range of measures that have taken place. We've obviously seen low interest rates. It's been a big feature. There have been various forbearance and debt support schemes put in place, whether through regulators or through the social welfare system. There's been reforms to regulating credit markets to try and prevent debt buildups in the future, and various measures of that kind have taken place. Now, the problem is, I guess, that as David Graeber suggested, a lot of these measures do not confront head-on the problem of excessive household debt. And even sympathetic policymakers don't really see effective tools for confronting this problem head-on. And that's why I think it's interesting to pursue the possibility of bankruptcy as a pre-existing, long-standing tool, which actually discharges debt routinely and as of right. So the key feature of bankruptcy is if an insolvent individual, an individual who cannot pay her debts, enters into the bankruptcy process on complying with the relevant conditions, etc., this individual will be discharged from her debt. And that's the legal terminology, meaning that the debt of this individual will be cancelled at the end of the process. So bankruptcy is one long-standing institution which we have in our society, which actually confronts head-on this idea, the problem of debt, and actually tries to reduce debt levels by providing debt relief. So the rest of the talk is going to kind of put forward this idea that bankruptcy has something to offer in this light, which maybe other policy measures can't quite achieve. And that might be because we might look at some of the limitations of some of the actions that have been taken up to this point. So if we look at regulatory measures that have been taken, they generally have involved two different types. So one is forbearance measures which require creditors, to act in a restrained manner when trying to collect debts from households in financial difficulty. And the other strand is preventative measures. These would be regulatory measures which try to regulate credit markets going forward into the future, and these prevent, future buildup of debt, for example. The obvious limitation with this approach is that we're either just arguing for restraint or we're arguing for future prudence in lending practices, but this won't necessarily do much to reduce the mountain of debt that is built up historically. So it might provide for better operating markets in the future, but there are question marks about whether this will actually succeed in tackling the problems that we have allowed to build up over decades in effect. Then another point of view that is sometimes put forward is that we could design our debt contracts differently. For example, Mian and Sufi put forward the idea that mortgage contracts could involve an equity sharing component whereby the household and the bank share both the benefits but also the risks of mortgage contracts. So if house prices go up, the benefit is shared between the household and the bank. If there's a downturn, the losses should be shared between the household and the bank rather than the current position where they all fall on the household. Now, the problem with this, I guess, is that it's a very much a contract by contract approach, and no household who's in financial difficulty has just one problem debt. Generally speaking, there are several problem debts, a range of different contracts, all which would have to be designed and adjusted like this. It's also effectively requiring these kind of contracts to be to start becoming common in the marketplace and to start becoming desirable products, which may maybe change from a current market that we may not necessarily see this occurring. Bankruptcy, on the other hand, has this beauty in that it doesn't involve investigation of individual debts and the terms of individual debts, the terms of individual contracts. Instead, it has this bright line position that if you are insolvent and you meet the criteria for excessive bankruptcy, all your debts can be discharged without further investigation, which is something that is quite appealing. Now, you might say, what about monetary policy? What has monetary policy done? Surely there have been benefits to household debt from low interest rates over the past decade. And the problem is, I guess, twofold, really. One is that there's only so much can be done in that interest rates hit the zero lower bound and then they lose somewhat of their effectiveness, right? In that you can only get down to zero and then which we've been close to for a long period of time, and that is necessarily the limit of low interest rates. But what is also interesting from the household point of view is that despite interest rates looking like this over the past decade or so, a dramatic fall in Bank of England official bank interest rates, this is not necessarily passed through very clearly to households. So this graph here, sorry if it's a bit fuzzy on your screen, but this graph is just showing the kind of interest rates paid by households, whether for credit cards or personal loans over the past decade, and you'll notice the shape of the graph is very different. So we see not a lot of change in the interest rates paid by households, actually, even if central bank rates are very low. So maybe while large corporations can borrow at very low rates, if the average household, it simply doesn't seem to benefit from interest rates in this way. Mortgage interest rates, of course, will fall, but even Bank of England's studies have shown that it can take sometimes up to a couple of years for the effect of a negative or a drop in the central bank rate to be passed on to households due to the structure of mortgage markets and mortgage contracts. Another point that has been made is that there have been studies emerging recently, again from Mian and Zulfi and related economists, to show that low interest rates actually contribute to raising asset prices, and this actually can exacerbate inequality, and this can actually lead to negative effects for the middle and low income families that we were talking about, because they can't access credit to grow their wealth in the same way that the kind of elites in our society are able to do so. Now, you might say, what about the social welfare system? Isn't this the institution that should be dealing with household financial difficulties? And, you would probably be right. A lot of studies have shown that bankruptcy can help individuals in financial difficulty. The outcomes for people who enter bankruptcy to deal with the debt problems are much better for the outcomes for people who don't enter bankruptcy and try to struggle through their debt problems without the help of bankruptcy. But a lot of studies also show that there are certain financial difficulties which can't simply be resolved by the fresh start afforded by bankruptcy. Certain households will have long-term financial problems, and that a robust social welfare system might be needed to deal with that. However, there are certain advantages to bankruptcy which maybe the social welfare system in its current form do not provide. One is the idea that bankruptcy can operate as an automatic stabilizer. So if there is a generous bankruptcy law on the books, every time there's an economic crisis, households can automatically avail of this existing institution. So it doesn't involve the kind of tortured post-crisis politics, which we've seen a lot in recent years, whereby we have to create new solutions from scratch to deal with the present crisis. Rather, if bankruptcy laws are on the books and people can avail of them when crisis strikes, that might have certain advantages. And from that point of view, we can look at what's happened in terms of our politics recently. There's been fierce political debate in the UK over the question of what is quite to me, a trifling question of whether or not households should have £20 more per week in their social welfare benefits, which seems like such a meager offering to start with, given the financial position that a lot of households are in. But this is proven politically torturous. The idea that we could have expansion of the social welfare provision to the extent needed to deal with kind of large household debt problem we're facing in this country just seems politically impossible at the moment. Bankruptcy perhaps can be a little bit more politically palatable because it is a solution that can potentially appeal both across the left and right spectrum to some degree. From some point of view, it is a market-based solution in that the costs of bankruptcy are not necessarily borne by the state. We don't involve the state handing out money to individuals to help them to pay their debts. Instead, what we see is bankruptcy imposing losses on the market actors themselves, the credit market actors, and that creditors should bear the costs of providing debt relief to individuals. And the idea is that this could be a market-based solution. It could actually make credit markets more efficient if market actors have to, lend cautiously, knowing that generous bankruptcy laws are there when things go wrong. So there is an idea that even if there's political opposition about the role of the state on the market, maybe bankruptcy can meet somewhere in the middle in a way that might be politically palatable. Having said that, many institutions who are looking at the household debt problem after the global financial crisis over the past decade put forward the idea that we should create new institutions to deal with household debt problems, which are market-based debt resolution mechanisms. In other words, institutions which involve getting borrowers and lenders, debtors and creditors together to negotiate solutions to debt problems. Now, this is a solution that works very well in certain areas of the economy, and it's an idea that has emerged in the field of corporate bankruptcy, whereby we have this idea of debt restructurings carried out between businesses and their creditors, which can allow both parties to benefit. The company can stay alive while the creditors can also get a decent amount of the debt repaid. But the idea that this will work work in the context of financially troubled households with very limited resources, where there are information asymmetries, where there are severe market failures which have led to the debt problems in the first place. The idea that we could produce an efficient market bargaining at the ex-post phase when these individuals are actually in a very financially vulnerable position seems to be problematic. And there will be a lot of consumer law literature to show why we might not get efficient bargaining in this kind of context. The market conditions needed for the kind of ideal of efficient bargaining would not be present. So I would argue from this point of view that we need to turn to bankruptcy and to embrace the fresh start policy of bankruptcy, the idea that bankruptcy offers a chance to the individual who is insolvent to be discharged from her debts and to receive a fresh start. And there has been a long-standing appreciation, as this quote from the US Supreme Court in the 1930s illustrates, that this is a public interest benefit rather than from a benefit purely to the insolvent individual. The idea is that if we free households from the burden of historic debt, this is a way of reallocating the risks in a debt-based economy in an efficient manner and freeing these households so that they can contribute to our economic present rather than being trapped in the past of historic debt burdens. So this is the appeal of bankruptcy, in that we have an institution already existing which provides debt relief routinely and as of right. We do not have to reinvent the wheel, and we can confront head-on the problem of excessive household debt. There have been some studies conducted which show the benefits of bankruptcy, not just for the financially troubled individuals, but most appealingly, I think, or interestingly to me, there's some evidence emerging now, studies over the past few years, such as this one from 2019 by O'Clair and Dobby, which looked at differences in bankruptcy laws across US states, the respective generosity of the bankruptcy protections provided in different US states. And they found that in the time of the Great Recession, the bankruptcy laws, which were more generous in certain US states, actually helped to support employment in the economies of those states, because they were basically providing financial protections to households, which allowed these households to, keep the economy ticking over, keeping people employed, keeping businesses running. So there's very promising evidence emerging. We need more evidence to take place of the link between bankruptcy and these wider economic benefits, but it is very much appealing to look at the evidence that is emerging so far, and it seems to point further towards this potential for bankruptcy. Obviously, I'm not saying bankruptcy is a perfect solution in all situations. There are problems involved. So bankruptcy, as we currently understand it, just applies to insolvent individuals, so effectively people who have hit rock bottom. They have no resources available to pay their debts. There might be a wider group in our society who have some resources available, but have not quite hit this position of insolvency. Should the law be expanded to deal with those kind of debt problems? Do the same arguments apply that we have, like maybe a group in the middle of our society who have some income and assets available? They are not people with nothing to lose, but they should still be provided financial assistance, both for their own benefit and for the benefit of the wider economy. There are also, in order to put bankruptcy to work and to work as a public policy solution in the manner that I've suggested, it might involve a certain reimagining of bankruptcy. So bankruptcy is a long-standing institution which has existed in England and Wales, for example, for hundreds of years. And it has a different roles, different identities at different times in history. At times it was known as a part of the commercial law, which was just designed basically to provide returns on investments to creditors, a means for creditors to kind of squeeze individuals and to get as much repayment as possible of debt from them. At other times it's had a kind of quasi-criminal character, and there's still this idea of moral hazard associated with not paying our debts, the idea that the bankruptcy law should have a certain punitive element, or that other institutions in our society, such as a credit reporting system, should have a certain punitive element so that we ensure that people are incentivized to repay their debts. But all of these issues can be addressed through certain safeguards in the legislation. But of course, it involves a certain degree of creativity and imagination to understand bankruptcy in its contemporary context, away from this historical kind of overhang. Another problem with the current system in England and Wales is that it has been effectively underfunded, commercialised, privatised. So one paradox of the law is that people entering bankruptcy must provide an upfront fee of £700, which is going to be very difficult for many people in our economy, but especially those who are over indebted. This has led to the kind of development of a secondary market in insolvency, whereby private debt advice or debt solution providers will sell debt solutions to individuals, and we've seen actually falls in bankruptcy numbers in recent years and rises in these commercially provided solutions. Again, if we are to deploy bankruptcy to fulfill its potential in dealing with the household debt crisis, I think perhaps we need to tilt this balance a little bit more towards the use of the public institution of bankruptcy and away from the kind of commercialized current model. So there's work to be done in order to put bankruptcy to work, in order to fulfill its potential, and in order to operate as a public policy solution to deal with the pressing contemporary crisis of excessive household debt. But hopefully this is one way forward, and this at least offers us the promise of addressing this problem, which seems to be a most urgent one in the current context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting, and we may have time for one or two questions. If anyone has one, please put them in the chat. I mean, I'll just start by asking, since you sort of started advocating this policy, do you feel like it's had any traction? I mean, you've convinced me it's an eminently sensible idea. So are people receptive to it, or if not, why not?
Yeah, I think there has been recognition that we need to take action in this area. So it's been quite interesting. Over the past couple of years, the UK government agency, the Insolvency Service, carried out a consultation regarding certain tweaks, I guess, to the insolvency system to increase access for the lowest income groups. But what was emerging in the consultation, and which the Insolvency Service widely recognized, was that respondents to the consultation were very much advocating for a wider comprehensive review of the entire bankruptcy system, so in its contemporary context. And now the government has agreed to carry out that review. And this would be the first major review of bankruptcy law really since the 1980s. So this is a very promising opportunity. There is a recognition that we need to start rethinking how the system works and how it can best meet our contemporary economic conditions. So I am hopeful that something is happening. Conversations are now taking place, and it looks like it seems to be a good time to be considering reform.